Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today I want to talk to you about the value of conflict happening in a relationship. We need to be in places where we can allow conflict to happen and live by high standards of how we engage that conflict. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
Hello, my friends. Welcome. I hope that your day is going well wherever you're going today. Today, I want to talk to you about something that I see a lot in therapy. We talk a lot about in therapy. I talk with my clients. I talk with my friends about. And it is this idea that somehow we're responsible when other people get mad. In part because there is truth to it. I should say there is some truth to it. There is some truth to the idea that if I intentionally do something that I know you find frustrating, I'm responsible at some level for you being mad. Now, one of the things that you know, if you've been with me for any amount of time, is I do not believe that you can make me do anything. If you're one of my children and you want to get in trouble at my house, all you have to say is, it made me. You made me. Whatever that means, it made me, you made me. Because the truth is, nothing makes you. Nothing makes you. And that can be a very provocative position. But one of the things that we talk about, and I just had a conversation with a client this week, we were talking about something, and both of them were like, well, I just didn't do it because the other person would be mad. And I said, okay, there's some value to that, but there's also some value to the idea that it's okay to do something even if you know your spouse is going to get mad. And there's tension there. There's wisdom needed there. Because, of course, we don't want to be the person that just does things that infuriate other people, that just does things that causes anger. But where I see this really go rogue is with kids, right? Parents and kids. Well, I don't want to make the kid mad. Well, no, we're not supposed to exasperate them. We're not supposed to do things to intentionally bring anger into their lives. But what happened to letting people get angry and having an expectation of how they should act? Having an expectation of minimal standards of behavior? That's my question that I often run into with people. Well, wait, why couldn't you have done that and then just had the conversation about it? And what I mean by that is what really started this thought process for me was I had a client who wanted to do something. He and his wife were going to do something. And then at the last minute, she changed her mind and he was upset and she was upset that he was upset. And neither one of them actually talked about it. And so because they didn't want to engage in the argument with each other, what happened was they didn't talk to each other because, well, they might be mad when we talk. Well, yeah, they probably will be. But if you engage that conversation, even when they're mad, you just have to have a standard of behavior that you expect from them. And that is how we create healthy relationships. I've said this before, and I'll continue to say it. The price that we pay for intimacy is conflict, is engaged conflict handled well. And so one of the things that I really encourage my clients to do, that I hope I encourage my family to do, is engage conflict well. And now here's the thing. We do have to think about this. This does not universalize. One of the things that I had somebody reach out to me, they're like, hey, my dad listens to your podcast and he feels like I should be doing the things that you're saying in there with him. And I feel it's a little bit different. So, of course, I email him back and I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? And she was like, well, my dad's kind of toxic. He says very mean things. And I feel like you're talking more about, family that you're living with, not necessarily family of origin. And this is a hot button topic. If you listen to the episode on constructs, you'll know that it literally comes right out of our constructs for how we operate. Right and wrong, how we do things comes right out of, or is what creates this conflict within her, and even within me, because I don't know her dad, I don't know his side of the story, but she is right. Like there is I have a different obligation to engage conflict with my wife than I do with my brother or my dad or my sister. I have a different obligation to process that conflict. I still have an obligation with all of them to do it well, but sometimes doing it well means, okay, look, we're not getting anywhere, and I do have to draw a boundary here. And I know that that is under attack today, that the idea of drawing boundaries, it's under attack all the way from the far right people like Ben Shapiro to the far left people like CNN. I'm seeing articles of both sides of it. Probably because, like most things in psychology, it's overdone. But there is value to that. And we're so afraid to engage in conversations of opinion in our side. In fact, it's really interesting to me. I was hanging out with some friends, I don't know, probably about 2 months ago. We all were getting coffee. And it was me and then 3 couples were at the coffee shop. I was there, and I think they showed up. Maybe 2 of them showed up together, and one other couple was coming or something like that. But anyhow, the 7 of us are talking, and one of the husbands started to talk about something somewhat controversial. It didn't really seem that controversial to me. But immediately his wife was like, okay, all right. And clearly it was a point of conflict for them. But it reminded me that we're not willing to let people be irritated or passionate and expect some level of standard behavior. And part of that is because we've done away with the idea of standard behavior. Right? You think about a lot of, if you're not angry, you're part of the problem. You bet I'm angry because I'm an empowered, fill in whatever the last word is. And so one of the things that we've done is we've done away with the standard, and we've also done away with agreeing or disagreeing agreeably. And so like with this couple that I'm thinking about where they were struggling with like, okay, I want to do this, she doesn't. It's not a moral issue. It's not he wanted to go get drinks with another woman and go dancing. It wasn't anything like that. He was actually going to go with family members to do something in nature. And here's the thing, he might have ended up not doing it anyhow because he might have decided that it wasn't worth the conflict or the fight. We have to talk about 2 different types of conflict here. There is the conflict where like, I don't know, I want to go to a baseball game. My wife doesn't want me to, so maybe I decide not to. But there's also the conflict of having the conversation about what I want to do and what she doesn't want me to do. And that's the conflict that we're talking about today. That's the conflict that has to be engaged. And it needs to be engaged in many ways across probably many different relationships. Because if you think about it, this is why we're running into distress in society. Because what happens is, I know in my own little community here, I'll watch this. I do have an unfair advantage. I get to see it from inside the room, right? People bring it in the room. But there will be people who will be saccharine sweet or fake sweet to someone's face, but then they're not necessarily mean, but the other person thinks, okay, we're going to engage. If you go back to the constructs episode again, and I don't mean to keep referencing that, but these really do go hand in hand. If you go back to that episode, they create a construct in their mind that like, hey, we're going to go forward into this thing. We're going to do these things or whatever it is. And the other person is like, there's no way, because they won't engage the conflict. And some of this comes down to I talked about this already, we don't have standards of what is basic behavior. Like, how can you be angry and still have a conversation and be okay? By and large, we either, like, you can yell and scream and do whatever you want, or you can't be angry at all. We live at those 2 extremes. And we almost worship the idea of you can't be mad. You can't be too intense. And if you listen to the series on men, I really think that's part of what's killing men. We're not allowing them to be intense, except in one arena. They can be as intense as they want to be in sports, as long as it's in the man cave, where we can make fun of it. And I'd love for man caves to go away, so that's a whole nother day. But when we start engaging the conversation, any conversation of worth, that we should have a passionate opinions that we can hold loosely, and we should have a space to have that conversation where the other person can have whatever emotion they have. Let them be angry and expect that they will behave appropriately. Certainly when it comes to our kids, we should have this. They can be angry. We just have standards of behavior. And here's the thing that I believe is true of almost all human beings. They tend to live up or down to the standard of behavior that you have for them. They tend to live up or down to the standard of expectation that you have for them. And so we want to have expectations of good behavior. And maybe in your family, there is no raising a voice. If that's what you want to live, fine. In our family, there is raised voices. And there is constant conversations about what is yelling and what is not. you can feel whatever you feel and just have the hard conversation. Because here's what happens often when we don't engage in the behaviors that, because we're afraid of the conflict, we start scorekeeping and we build resentment. Right? When I'm upset and I'm like, well, I'm not going to talk about it because my wife won't hear me. I've now put a check mark somewhere back in my brain about how I lost, how she wronged me. And really, I'm the one that wronged me. I'm the one that did the silly thing that refused to engage in the behavior. Well, what if when I engaged the behavior with her, what if I tried to have the conversation with her, she got mean? That's on her. You can't control her. That's the thing that you have to run out. And that's the problem with this idea of I'm never going to engage in any conflict. We're really trying to control things that we can't control, namely other people and outcomes. In fact, at some level, I think it's almost insulting to our spouse or our partner when we refuse to engage the conversation, because essentially what we're saying is they can't handle being upset. They can't handle being angry and still talk in an appropriate way. And before you come for me and you're like, well, Joe, that's true. Here's my question. Have you ever had a conversation about what it means to be upset and have appropriate behaviors? Well, they should act the same way. Come on, that's not realistic. There's going to be a different tone. There's going to be a higher level of volume. But how much higher? What's the appropriate agreement? What's the structure that we have for disagreeing? That's what we're going after here. Because here's the thing. All you're doing is punting the argument down the road when you refuse to have the conversation because she might not act right. She might not be able to handle it. And eventually you still have the fight. And it's worse now because that pressure has been building up. I really enjoy watching fail videos and wreck videos. I'm not going to lie. Because, well, I'm trying to do a podcast episode here on confronting what's real. So last night, my son and I are watching a video where this kid fills a water jug with an accelerant and then lights it. And of course, the water jug shoots out of his hands. He created a rocket, and it bounces around the room, and the kid's dodging, and he's got his hands up in the air over his head. And my son's like, I wonder where it ended up and what the rest of the room looks like, because the camera view is very narrow. But that's what we do with relationships when we refuse. I'm just not going to have that conversation because they might get mad. You have to engage the conversation, because when you don't, all you're doing is punting it down the road, and so that when the fight does come, it's worse. Now, here's the thing. Before we get to that place, in other words, before we actually get to the place we're going to have an argument, we have to do some upfront work. We have to do some upfront conversations. Hey, when we're upset, what's the expectation of how we'll engage each other? What are the expectations of behaviors? When we disagree passionately, how will we engage that conversation? Now, of course, I have some bias towards this. I think you should be utilizing the 6 rules of communication. I think you should be utilizing ABC method. I think you should be utilizing the mirror method. But you can utilize and do whatever you want there. You just need to make sure that there's some sort of agreed upon beforehand expectation about how you're going to engage the conversation. So if I want to go watch the next total eclipse, which is going to be like 8 hours from here, and you don't, and I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to go. How do we engage that? If you say something and I instantly feel angry about it, how do we engage that? If you do something or I do something and you instantly feel angry, how do we engage that? How do we engage when we're distressed with each other? This is the crux of the conversation that I'm encouraging you to have before you're distressed with each other. And then you have to have expectations of trial and error. You have to have expectations that it might not go well when you're having your next argument, when you're having your next moment of distress. It may not go well. And so then you're going to add constructs. You're going to add structure to it. You're going to say, okay, so we thought this, but that didn't work. We're going to do this. And you're going to continue to engage, knowing that failing is part of the process. Because when we engage with the expectation that it's likely we're going to fail a little bit, or maybe even a lot in this process, failing isn't that big of a deal. Because what we're doing is we're saying the relationship's health is more important to me than my comfort. Because really, when we punt that conversation down the road, what we're doing is we're saying my comfort is more important than the health of the relationship. And that is clearly problematic. That's clearly a problem. Now, there are times where we might say, you know what, this isn't worth an argument. This isn't that big of a deal. But here's the thing. Too often we do that not because it isn't a big deal, but because we just don't want to deal with the discomfort of the conflict, the conversation. And so that's a question I have to ask myself. Am I avoiding this conversation because I don't want to deal with the discomfort of it? Or am I just avoiding the conversation because it's really not that big a deal? And once I have some ice cream, or once I have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or once I have a nap, I'll feel better and I won't care about it. At our house, we have basically an hour limit. We're like, hey, if it's still bothering us by this time, it's something that comes up. We need to give it space to breathe and grow and decide. But then once we get to that point, we have to have the conversation, even if it's uncomfortable. So I can't encourage you to do this enough. Do the legwork. Have the conversation. How do we engage these conversations ahead of time? I wish that this would become a societal conversation because it doesn't exist currently. If you and I disagree about something, rare is the friendship that can have that conversation in 2024 in America. Drives me nuts because we're simultaneously experiencing a loneliness epidemic. And I'll tell you why. We're experiencing a loneliness epidemic because we don't engage people that we disagree with. And there is no one in this world that you're going to agree with on everything, except maybe your dog. And even that you're not going to agree on because sooner or later, he or she's going to think it's okay to pee in the house and you're not going to agree. I hope you're not going to agree. And so we reach these levels of conflict where we're just like, okay. And what happens is every time we punt that down the road, the conversation and the relationship suffers. The conversation suffers because, as I said earlier, when you punt it down the road, the conversation ends up just being worse. The argument just ends up being worse because now then, instead of one issue you're dealing with, you're probably dealing with 4 or 5 or 6 or 10. But the relationship suffers because essentially what we're saying is, I don't trust you to behave a certain way. I don't trust you to maintain a certain level of standard. And this clearly brings distress. This brings distress to the relationship and to each person involved. And I'm telling you, I promise you, your relationships will get deeper when you have appropriate conflict-related conversations that you work through. It builds health. It builds deeper intimacy. All right, tell me your experiences with it. Write in, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. We got some more stuff coming. Hopefully you've been following me on TikTok or YouTube. I am Joe Martino is the handle there. I also have Substack if you prefer the minimalist approach. Just trying to come up with as many ways as we can to connect with you. Some future topics coming up. We're going to revisit the drug conversation. I've gotten a lot of emails about that. A lot of people talking to me like, hey, how do we have a conversation with our kids about cannabis use when my spouse uses cannabis or when both of us use cannabis? And that'll be a fun one for us to have. As always, if you find value in this, I would ask that you would share it with your friends. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.